Hey, Gabriot here with another Covenant 25 Monster Train Expert Guide. This time we're talking about early game. Can't be ignored. Early game can definitely get you sometimes. For those of you trying to string together good win streaks, you can't ignore the early game. I've honestly lost some pretty embarrassing ones. Broken some streaks that could have gone longer just because I stupidly didn't pay attention to the early game. So that's kind of what this one's about. As always, there is chapter markers below. You can either click into the description or just seek on the video bar for any particular thing you're looking at. And we're going to go deep with this one, so let's get into it here. I said let's get into it here. Okay. So I'm defining early game here as the ring/circles 1 through 3. So, just the first two fights and then that third fight that has the first kind of big boss. It's going to be either Talos or Daedalus. I do plan on doing one of these for the mid game and end game as well. Though I kind of already did an end game one with my Seraph guide. Check that out if you haven't. It's pretty comprehensive as well. But I think I'll still do one for the end game in general. But we're talking about the early game today. So, still take note of the bosses. Now you can look at the main 3 bosses that you're going to be facing, the particular variants of them. So you can see Daedalus, Talos, and specifically which versions they're going to be. And in my opinion, they're definitely not all created equal. Talos, the pushing variant, to me is like significantly harder than all the others. So if you see something that is going to be hard, you want to pay extra attention and make sure you get the proper answers. And on that note, prioritizing finding a tank I've found is generally better than prioritizing finding a sort of glass cannon type unit. Those tanks, they do enough damage typically in the early game to solo these bosses as long as you have some sustain to put on them, either through regen or alternatively some kind of damage over time you can stick on the boss like frostbite and whatnot. So combine a good tank with some good sustain cards like that and you can pretty much guarantee you'll be able to take those bosses on. But don't on that same note, don't completely ignore Seraph. You're gonna have to make kind of a judgment call, make sure you can beat the boss first, but you might be faced with some tough decisions sometimes. You might be offered a Wildwood Sap next to a Silence or something when Seraph the Patience in your future, and you really have to make a judgment call then. Can you be greedy and take the Silence, even though it's not going to do much for you in the early game? Or do you really need that Wildwood Sap? If you need the Sap, take the Sap. Trust me, it's better to try to, guarantee that win and figure something else out later than trying to just be greedy and then just have basically no chance against the first boss, or the first big boss, I should say. And then, know which trials you can take. Having that extra gold or that extra banner unit can be the deciding factor if you're going to be able to take on that early game ring 3 or not, or even ring 2 in some cases. Ring 2, on that same note, the ring 2 sweeper, if you don't have a tank, if you have a squishy champ that's not really going to survive many rounds or even one round against him, you need a tank, and without a tank you're just going to lose. So kind of the initial notes here. So let's talk about the first ring. So I generally recommend putting your champ on the top floor, just as a baseline. The way I would think that is choose to put them on the top floor, but make that be the kind of your first choice, and then think otherwise if maybe there's a reason not to. Sometimes there is, and that can range for a multitude of different reasons, but let's just talk about why I say put the champ on the top floor and just kind of build your main floor at the top. So one thing is you're usually only going to have stewards in your champ. You don't really have banner units, and in most of those cases, especially if your champ is a squishy one, you want to find time to actually find the stewards. You might not draw them in the opener, and you might need 2 of them in front. And you just you want to give yourself time to actually find that. You also want to give yourself time to like kill the units before they get to you, because even if you do get those stewards in front, you don't necessarily want to get them down to like half or below health by the time the boss comes around, because that's going to be an entire extra hit that you don't get. And also, just if there's any scaling or debuffs that you have, it gives you time to apply those. There's really just not much punishment to putting your units at the top. Now, some reasons I might not do that, we talked about, you might want 2 stewards in front of them. Well, if you get pip screwed on the top, if you only have 4 pip, you might just have to put them on the middle in that case. Pip fucked, I should say. We don't censor anything here. But yeah, but there's other things, like Little Fade, Firelight. You probably might want them either on the bottom or the middle. At the very least, you definitely want a 5 pip floor for Little Fade if you're doing the Firelight path, because you're kind of wasting your ability if you're not hitting. You kind of want to build horizontal there, and you don't want to just only hit 1 trade and steward with that if you can help it. Other ones I would say, the spell weakness applicating Tethys version doesn't really do much for you at the top floor. It's just 5 damage at that point, or 6 or whatever it is. But if you put it on the middle or bottom floor, that gives you time to find some spells and actually take advantage of that spell weakness. And then also Incant Wildenton, you get those 3 stings right off the bat, and it's nice to apply the scaling on all 3 of them, plus any other spells you draw in your opener. So if you got the enemy units at the bottom, you might just want to go in at the bottom there with Wildenton if you want the Incant version. Then also Mark of Evasion often makes you want to go to the bottom. Some of the Ring 1 enemies don't really have much damage coming in, but Mark of Invasion, if you can't kill those clergymen, that's going to be 15 damage on the top floor and 20 in the middle. You probably can't survive that, but you could just go to the bottom and there might only be 2 to 3 damage coming in, so that's really not an issue. The only time it's really an issue is if you are actually facing the clergymen. In that case, Mark of Invasion can be pretty tough, but we'll get to all of that in a bit. So let's go through what are all the possibilities that you can face in Ring 1. Well, first one I'm going to go over here is the Guardians of Light. These guys have that unique unit here that you won't see anywhere else in the game. And I'm not going to pretend to know their names. I don't really care to know their names, but I just call him the Damage Shield guy. So Damage Shield guy, he's kind of annoying. He does 3 damage. That's not too bad, but it's more than like the 2 that you typically find in these first 2 rings from a tank. And 40 health, it's not really all that different from the 45 or whatnot that you see with the other tanks. But the damage shield can definitely screw you, depending on the trial. So real quick, we'll just go over. There's in these first ring, same as the second ring, but basically all you're going to see is just 2 waves of enemies, then you get a rest, and then you fight your boss. So there's really not much going on, right? First guy, he's the only threat. This is probably the weakest unit in the game, the healer dude. Who cares about him, right? But sometimes you might want to, put a torch on him or something. Technically, a torch on him is more damage than putting a torch on this guy. Unless you can kill him, of course, with that torch. But anyway. Or if the torch is having spell damage for whatever reason. Yeah, and then the second one, hopefully you have some way to backline hit this guy. If not, it's not the end of the world. For the boss wave, it's, as far as Ring 1 is concerned, it's probably one of the more annoying boss waves just because this dude in the back, if you can't clear him, adds a ton of damage to the bosses. The bosses themselves, there's not much to go over with the Ring 1s. They're literally the same, like the same exact stats, and just for whatever reason, this one I guess is just objectively harder, the chain dude, just because he has that resolve, but it's really not that bad. It just, it makes it so you have to spend an energy for those waves and you lose a card draw, basically. All in all, they're not really all that different. And as far as the trials go, I listed aggressive as a tough trial. Granted, I'm usually taking the trials, obviously, if I can, but I would say the tough thing about aggressive is that's going to be, 4 damage. So these guys now do 7 damage. And that means, whereas normally, since there's only 2 of these guys coming in, you could put a train steward down and whatever on a floor. That has 8 health, and these guys aren't going to gain damage shield from those stewards. But at 7 damage, the second guy will gain damage shield from killing that steward, unless you have some sort of a heal or something else to mitigate that. So in that case, you got this 7 damage, pretty decent health tank that now has damage shield. That's probably representing some serious damage to your Pyre at that point. And on top of that, the dude in the back, if you can't kill him, that's also damage to the Pyre and your units. And then especially in the boss round, if you can't kill the backliner, a 9 damage backliner ring 1 is pretty devastating. They're going to kind of cut through your floors like butter. There's not much you can do with a starting deck to handle that. So if you don't have AoE or any sort of if you didn't start with a clan that has Plink or Torch, stuff like that, you might think twice about aggressive Amulet. Really think, do you have good starting cards? If not, you might not want to take it. And Retribution, I don't think is as bad as aggressive, but I still think it's pretty bad on this one because it essentially presents similar problems. It doesn't have the same problem with the Disciple here. I think that's the name of this unit. Spikes on him is whatever. If you have a spell that kills him, it either does or it doesn't. And spikes, it doesn't matter at that point. But what it really matters is on this frontliner, it's still adding basically, in this case, I think it's 3 spikes. So they're essentially doing 6 damage, but it's also doing it in an AoE fashion at this point to you. And keep in mind, Slay doesn't really care how he slays you. If it slays you from spikes, that's just going to add damage shield. So either way, you're in the same sense. If you played a steward to try to hit him on this wave, it's going to get that damage shield. So Retribution can be tough. As for, I didn't list the armor one as tough or easy. It's pretty dependent on your deck. The thing about armor is these troops don't represent a whole lot of damage to your Pyre. If you were to just hit at least them down, take off 10 armor on each of these frontliners and never kill anything else, that's just going to be, 12 plus 5, 17 damage to your Pyre. That's not like the end of the world. But it's also not easy because, this sucks having, these 2 guys in the back line. Whereas before you could kill him with a Plink, you could kill him with a Torch. With the armor you can't. So the boss wave in particular can be tough with the armor, but not enough that I would put it on the level of these. And then Mark of Invasion is pretty easy. I talked about before, if you can't fit your unit on the top due to Mark of Invasion, you can simply just put them on the bottom. And unless it's like a Tethys that has nobody in front of him, and it's like the Frostbite version of Tethys that has 3 health, that's like the only time that plan won't work. That's pretty unrealistic though. You're probably just going to be fine. You can probably just put your units in at the bottom at that point. So Mark of Invasion, really not too bad. On to Heaven's Priests. Pretty similar to the last one, right? Just easier, right? kind of in the same way that this guy's pretty similar to this guy, just easier. I don't know, weird, but whatever. This guy, he does less damage. He has 5 more health, has no damage shield slay. I'd say that's overall pretty much easier than the other dude, right? And then that's the same exact setup. You got the priest in the first wave. Second one, you get that disciple dude. The boss is just objectively easier as well. You don't have a dude pounding you with 5 damage each time. He just heals once at the end. Pretty irrelevant. So I didn't list anything as a tough trial here. I just don't think anything's really that tough. It's if you see Heaven's Priests, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief because you lucked out. And easy, I still left Mark of Invasion as the easy because for the same reasons, armor's still a similar story. Although armor's still a little bit easier because you don't have the backliner. I could probably make an argument that armor is an easy one here, but Anyway, aggressive still does add damage, and if you can't kill a tank, that's still some amount of damage to your Pyre, which always sucks. You don't want to take Pyre damage if you don't have to. And then spikes, they're not gaining damage shield or anything, but it still represents about the same addition of damage of spikes. But yeah, that's Heaven's Priests. Then you got the first defense. Looks a little bit different, and to be honest, I would argue a bit harder than even that first one. So the boss is the same. You got the dude in the back. That's kind of the hardest of the ring one boss setups you're going to get. Wave 1 is not so bad. It has this dude. It's interesting that the tank, the shield tank, has less health overall, because it's 5 health plus 25 energy, than the tanks that actually deal damage. I always thought that was interesting, but hey, I'll take it. That's how it is. And obviously they don't do any damage unless they have the aggressive amulet. And then wave 2 is kind of brutal. You got 2 of these disciples and then this tank. I mean, this tank is just whatever, but the 2 disciples behind can be kind of tough. Like, that's decent amount of damage coming to your Pyre if you don't kill them, and it's also a decent amount of damage to your actual floor of people. That's probably at least taking out your stewards, and hopefully you got something else. This can be a little bit devastating. First defense usually represents some serious Pyre health taken, even if you don't take a trial. But on that note, the aggressive amulet's going to be tough. It turns this unit, which is pretty non-threatening, into something that actually represents damage to your Pyre. Granted, it's still only 4, but it's not only is it damage to your Pyre, it's damage to your units. Then you got backliners that are tough to get to. If you can't get to them, that's a lot of damage coming in. And same story with the boss. If you can't get him, that's 9 damage each hit in that relentless round, and that's pretty hard to really get through in the first ring. And then armor emblem, I think, is especially brutal in this one, just because there's 4 of these dudes represented in this fight, and you're most likely not going to be able to take them out if they have the armor. There's just not many AoE spells that you start with that can take them out. There's a few, like Ice Storm, or not Ice Storm, but Ice Tornado could do it. Stuff like that, but the odds are not in your favor there, so armor emblem can be pretty tough here. Spikes, I said, wasn't really easy or hard. It's very similar to the last, kind of the other ones, I would say. They don't get any damage shield, which is why I don't put it in the tough, but it's still a lot of extra damage, so it's not necessarily easy. And I still listed Mark of Invasion as easy. Granted, this first floor does represent more damage to you. It's still only 1 5 hit versus the 3 and 4 that you get from Mark of Invasion, so it's still pretty safe to go into the bottom here if you can't kill the clergyman. And that's the first defense. And the final ring 1 group here is the Gathered Clergy. Pretty different from the other 3. And pretty boring. You're just going to get 4 clergymen at the start, 5 in the second one, the typical nothing on wave 3, and then the boss wave, instead of the bosses in front here, they're in the back, which is usually not an issue other than armor emblem. So armor emblem can be tough here, not because of these first waves, because to be honest, I highly recommend putting your units at the top here, unless, we'll get to Mark of Invasion in a bit here, but if you don't have Mark, even if you have Mark, I'd still try to fit them in at the top. The thing about the Rage is it'll completely run out by the time they get to the top, so they're literally doing 1 damage at that point, and that's really not that threatening at all. They're also pretty easy to clear out at 1 health. And the thing about armor emblem is I don't care too much about this. If I'm putting my units in at the top with armor emblem, that's only assuming I couldn't kill them all for whatever reason, that's only 4 damage to my units and then 5 damage to my units. And then to the Pyre, it's really nothing. 4 and 5 if I, for whatever reason, couldn't kill any, but usually you can kill a few. What makes armor emblem tough is the boss wave, because now you gotta chunk through 33 health before you get to the boss, and that's not even straightforward, right? You have to chunk through 11 health, and if there's any damage waste that went over there, it's kind of wasted. Then you got to chunk through another guy, then you got to chunk through another guy. It's actually makes the boss fight pretty hard when you take armor emblem. Hopefully you have like some front-loaded spells that can help with that. Or, yeah, I don't know, just a lot of sustain or something. Otherwise, you're going to have a tough time with Armor Emblem. Mark of Invasion, where it was easy in the other ones, I would list it as tough here. Just, I still take it a lot. Like I said, I would still go in at the top, especially since the top has 3 versus the 4 that'll be on the other 2 floors. But as we mentioned, the rage will go out by then. But the tough thing about Mark of Invasion here is there's really no safe floor to drop in at if you don't start with some spell damage or some sort of a tank. I mean, you're not really going to start with a tank round 1, but maybe like 1 spell and 1 steward. That might be enough to make your champ survive. Who knows? Or maybe you just started with a tanky champ and it's not too like sentient or something, and this is not an issue. But it can be an issue for a lot of champs, especially, like I said, if you don't have Plink, you don't have AoE. AoE and stuff will make short work of these, but if you don't have them, Mark of Invasion is pretty tough. And then I put Retribution as easy. It's, if you have any amount of spell damage at all, you're not going to care about spikes here. You're most likely killing all these dudes before they get to you. Like I typically, using like Tethys as an example, for the other 3 Ring 1 fights, I probably wouldn't take Retribution unless I had some serious big hitting spells to kill those tanks. But with Tethys, even just the simple act of having the spears, and if you have any other sort of spells that can deal damage, I would almost always take Retribution. I can stick Tethys at the top, and I'm most likely going to be able to kill all these things before they get to me. And then, at some point I'll just stick a steward or 2 in front and I'll have no real issue with the boss. But that's the Gathered Clergy. I'd say it's generally pretty easy. Really not too hard. Just that Armor Emblem, could catch you by surprise, but even then it's not too bad. So Ring 2. Now we start being, getting the capability to add cards to your deck. You're not just at the whim of your starting cards that were chosen for you. So, you want to start looking for quote-unquote boss-killing stuff. That's usually going to be some sort of sustain or some sort of scaling that's really going to tip things in your favor in a quick fashion, because, these early fights don't last too many waves, right? So as far as what you're offered Ring 2, you're always going to be offered 1 of each merchant and at least 1 banner unit. Usually 2, sometimes you'll just get 1 and then like gold on the other side. That's usually how it goes. I usually, it's obviously always going to be varying on your situation, but as a baseline, I generally just like to target the banner unit that I want more, and I don't care too much about the shop unless there's like a specific reason that I need some specific spell to be upgraded or something. Or if I need to like hunt really hard for a holdover or something, maybe I'll target a magic shop regardless of the banner unit. But in general, I generally would like to just prioritize getting a good banner unit. So, regardless if it's on the side of the Merchant of Steel or the Merchant of Magic, I would just kind of pigeonhole in onto the banner unit that I want. So I would develop your own preference for these. I can, this is a matter of opinion, but in my opinion, Stygian is just kind of the best. The way I look at Stygian banner units, there aren't any bad ones. I can't say that about any of the other clans. And there's just a lot of great ones. So you're just never going to go wrong with Stygian. And almost every Stygian unit provides some pretty good boss killing capabilities. There's a few that don't, because they're a little bit squishy, but in general, you got really good tanks. You got both the sharks. Siren of the Sea is great. It kind of hybrids tank and DPS. There's just a lot of good options. You can even end up with something like a Lodestone Totem or whatnot, which is a very unique unit, but it'll crush pretty much everything in the game. And then my next is Awoken. I do think Woken has a few bad units and a few very situational ones, but there's also a few of them that are just so good. Like I find Animus of Will to be one of the best. Okay, Animus Will is one of the best units in the game, but I'm not recommending that as your first. It's obviously not going to be a tank, but you know, as far as tanks go, they've got Husk, they've got Vine Mother, they got the Hollows, even the Wilting Wood Sap. It would be a good option. I'm usually not using that as my end game option, but it's a fine option for like just taking on the first boss. You got to remember, you're looking to beat the first boss. You're not setting up your complete end game yet. A lot of times you're just adding these units to get through that early game, and you remove them later, basically, once you find something better. Then next is Melting Remnant. I find Melting Remnant have a pretty good line of units. I suppose I wouldn't actually say Melting Remnant has any bad units, but I don't know. They're very situational is the thing. They don't have ones that fit every deck, right? So there's going to be some variance there, and Umbra is the same way. But all that being said, I guess Umbra I do consider to have a higher amount of worse units. I don't particularly like if I'm just starting in the first few rings, I wouldn't want the Morsel Masters and whatnot. And even something like the Alloy really needs good morsel generation already to justify. But something like a Crucible Collector or a Warden can just carry you. You don't need many morsels to make them good. If you can just feed them like on average once a round, that's going to be enough to pretty much kill any of the first bosses. But then there's other stuff that kind of takes a while to get going, like Overgorger. It's like it only has 15 health early on. It's not going to have any damage. It'll get great later on, but it's kind of hard to get going. But I don't know, they're okay. And then I have Hellhorn kind of way at the bottom. The Hellhorned banner, it represents something way different than any of the other banners to me. Like the Hellhorn banner is so unenticing that I never ever go out of my way to take a Hellhorn banner, let's put it that way. I almost prefer Trained Steward sometimes. Like sometimes I'll just skip the Hellhorn banner unit and go for the gold. I really don't like Hellhorn units. Demon Fiend's just unplayable in the early game, and generally just not worth it unless you can cheese it out, in my opinion. And then all the other units are just really lackluster. They have one okay unit, I guess, which is the Deranged Brute. And then everything else at best is just mediocre, in my opinion. But, sometimes you need a unit, and Hellhorn can suffice. They have some like slightly tanky units that you could use. They're pretty bad tanks, but if you need a tank, they're there. But anyway, I digress. If you end up on the side with the Merchant of Steel, you really want to try to get some armor, HP, or if you're Stygian, that armor incant upgrade. Just adding some extra tankiness will pretty much guarantee you can take on those early bosses. Especially remember there's that Ring 2 sweeping boss. You don't want to get caught off guard by that guy, because if you do, game over. Like, you can have a nice damage dealer like Siren Nameless Siren, great unit by mid to end game, but if you don't have a tank, doesn't matter. Like, she only has 10 health, right? But let's say you do, and let me make this point too. Let's say you take your banner unit and you don't get offered a tank, but you get offered like a good unit like that Nameless Siren. You should still take her, and then really, hopefully, if you're on that Merchant of Steel side, really try to add some health to her, or that armor incant, because in that case, even though she's not a tank, you've added enough tankiness that she'll be able to take on the sweeper. But if you don't, you're just going to lose. So, yeah, beat that point to death. Stats increase. Stat increase is obviously going to be great. Like if you're fighting that Ring 2 sweeper, let's say you have something like a Guardian out of that Guard of the Unnamed, which you would normally not ever think of it as a damage dealer, right? You purely think of him as a tank. Hell, let's even say Vine Mother, who doesn't have any natural attack. But if that's your tank, and you have like Tethys as your champ, and you're facing the sweeper, you might as well just if you say you have Root Seeds or Razor Sharp Edge, you might as well stick that on Vine Mother in preparation for that boss, because that's the only way you're going to beat that boss. Alright, so what do we got for the Ring 2? waves here, or mobs, I should say. Well, we got Barbed Disciples. They got this girl in the back that basically enchants everybody with spikes. She's kind of annoying. Definitely annoying if you got a squishy champ like Tethys or the slave version of Hellhorn Prince. Not so annoying if you're a tanky champ or if you got a tanky banner unit already. Or if you got any backline clear. So really, she's not actually that bad on average. But if you can't deal with her, she can kind of screw you over a little bit. It's only 2 spikes though, so it's really not that bad. I don't really find this this mob to be that hard. So yeah, you got that first wave like that. First, basically pretty similar stuff. You got a tank, damage dealer. Wave 2 is actually, kind of easier even. You just got that tank, and then there's no actual like big damage dealers. And as far as the boss goes, hopefully you can. This is the boss wave is really where I think this unit can actually screw you over. And that's why the only tough trial I listed here was Armor Emblem, because if you can't kill this backliner here, well, you're going to have an extra 2 damage basically added to your entire floor. Even more for whatever reason you have multi-strike by this point. And that's going to be hard to beat these kind of somewhat beefy bosses. But anyway, and then for easy trials, Mark of Invasion for similar reasons as we talked about before, just not a whole lot of damage down here. And then the other ones are just whatever, extra damage on them. It's kind of annoying, but it doesn't really change a whole lot. And spikes on them, you kind of already are dealing with spikes. A few extra spikes can suck, but you don't have to hit like that many here. You could argue it's maybe tough. I just haven't really found it to be that tough, taking on the spikes. Again, it's not like there's that much punishment for units to die to spikes in this mob. And if you have a proper tank, they're not going to die to spikes anyway. And, quick note on the bosses. It's interesting that the variety that you'll find in Ring 2, because I just think the sweeper dude is objectively way harder than the others. You compare it to this knight dude down here, they got almost the same stats, just this dude the dude down here has a little bit more attack, but compare 2 more attack to 6 sweeping attack, I'd say I can't think of too many situations where this dude's going to be harder, right? If you got a good tank that can take this guy on, they can take this guy on as well. But if you're kind of relying on like a tank that doesn't have any damage and a backliner that's squishy that has your damage, well, you could still take that guy on, but you're not going to take that sweeper on. And then this guy's kind of in the middle of the road. He essentially is kind of like an AoE with his spikes, but his spikes are pretty weak. In this particular one, they could be strong just because of the enchanter, but in a general sense, you're not going to see this on the other mobs. So he'll only have 2 spikes in those fights. And he does have more health, but less damage. If you compare it to the sweeper, you can almost think of it as like he does the same damage to the front unit, but then just less damage to the back units at the trade-off of having a little bit more health. I'd say in general, the sweeper is still just harder than that boss. Yeah, and that's pretty much the comments I have on the Ring 2 bosses. So I got the next one here is Disciple Conduits. This is very similar to the Clergyman, if you remember that group, except now instead of 4 clergymen at the start, one of them is replaced with this girl that gives everybody haste. And then the wave 2, instead of however many clergymen it is, they shuffled in just some different units here, but all of them still have 1 health. So like, I don't know, I feel like you have more rewards by this point in the game, and like you probably have even a higher chance of having AoE, or at least decent like removals. That I don't really find this to be too hard of a fight. And even the boss wave, you compare it to the last one, you have to chunk through this tank here, and you also have like spikes being applied. I guess the only thing, the haste is like, it'll give you a little less time if you set up at the top. Or if for whatever reason you did something real dumb and set up in the middle, they'll just pass you over. Definitely don't do that against Disciple Conduits. Pro tip. But, in general, this is just way easier. I did put Mark of Invasion as tough here for the same reasons that Clergyman was tough. It still represents a lot of damage that if you, for whatever reason, can't drop in a non-awkward way on turn one, Mark of Invasion can prevent troubles, especially when you have to factor in with the haste. Let's say you set up at the top. You can clear them out, but then maybe turn two you can't clear everything out. You actually have a full floor of dudes coming at you, and they'll still have 3 attack by that point because they still have a rage stack, and that can be kind of hurtful. I've definitely had some painful moments when that happened. But anyway, easy. I put armor as easy here because unlike clergymen who have 3 dudes in front of the boss, there's only 1 in front here, and the one in the back's only doing 1 damage. I really don't care about that. And as far as these, like even with the haste, they still only do 1 damage by the time they get to their pyre. So it's like, I don't know, who cares if they get through, because the extra armor made it so you couldn't kill them. It's almost just pretty irrelevant. So armor is almost like, I would almost say you should always take armor here no matter what. It's just not going to change much unless I guess if you had like 5 or less pyre health, maybe don't. But otherwise, I'd pretty much always take armor emblem here. That's like a gimme. And Retribution, similar. It's like you're probably going to be able to kill all these things with spells if you have any sort of spell damage, or AoE, anything really. Plinks, a lot of basic cards will even take that out. And even not, it's still not like that much extra damage coming in. So Retribution's almost a gimme too as well. I almost thought about putting the aggressive amulet here too, but in the cases where you couldn't kill it, compared to spikes, the aggressive amulet represents a lot more damage coming into your frontliner at least, and that could probably spell defeat. So I didn't list it as tough or easy. Then we got the Pyre Absorbers. I would generally find these a little bit harder than the last 2. This guy's basically the same stats as the hooded tank, except now when you want to incant, it just gives him permanent damage. It's not too bad. It's kind of more of a nuisance than anything. But I guess what I find hard about this troop on top of all that, like if you go back to Barbed Disciples, like you had a guy that didn't do damage, then you had this guy, but then on this one, it's like this guy's just this guy or girl, I don't know, but is objectively easier than this, right? And then you got this, sure, that's like whatever, but I don't know. I feel like this is just harder, right? Like you have the arrow dude coming in both times, and this tank on both of them is a tank that does damage. Even if you never incanted him, he's doing at least as much damage as 2 spikes, and that's assuming you didn't even kill that girl, right? So overall, I just find this way harder than the other ones. Not that it's like a super hard or anything, but I don't know. I don't think it's like super balanced, but I'm just bitching. Anyway, the boss fight, unlike the other ones, there's nobody in front. They're all in the back here. But that's almost irrelevant. It's like, who cares about the healer dude in the back? This is all you really care about, the fact that there's a arrow dude behind. That can be a little bit annoying. It was almost enough that I put aggressive amulet as a tough trial, but I don't know. I feel like up here, it's only adding damage to like 5 units because there's all these healers. So I didn't really think it was tough or easy. It's like it adds some damage, but it really doesn't add that much damage. Armor can be tough though. This guy, it's like he'll be even beefier, and and it'll take even more spells to kill him, thus giving him more damage. It'll also be hard to not incant him to try kill these backliners. Otherwise, you're just going to take a ton of damage to your waves and your pyre. So there's often not really a good non-awkward way to play through armor emblem. And then easy, Mark of Invasion should be relatively easy. You just can put your units in at the bottom if you have to, and then I guess you just don't can't that turn. And then Retribution also really shouldn't provide anything too hard, especially when you factor in the boss has nothing in front of him there. And that's the Pyre Absorbers. And the final one we got here, unlike the last one, just really easy, the Pentitent Prayers. Instead of an incanter, you got the objectively easier version here. You also only have 2 units in the first wave, and this one just does 1 damage, and the resolve is like pretty not impactful in my opinion. Like, all of the other Scourge Shufflers in the game are kind of a pain, but because it basically requires you to answer the Scourges that they shuffle, but I don't find these the only thing that this really does is if you don't kill him, is make your draw, make you not be able to dig through your deck. That's about the only punishment, which early on I don't think is really that much of an issue. Otherwise, it's a 1 damage unit that shuffles cards into your deck that don't actually damage you, so you don't actually have to purge them. You're probably not going to cycle back through your deck anyway in this short fight, so I don't really find these guys very hard whatsoever. And then the second fight here, it's a lot of health to get through, I guess, but the first dude doesn't do any damage, the second one doesn't do much damage, and then the dude in the back, 1 damage, kind of just whatever. But for this wave alone, wave 2, and the boss wave, I did say aggressive Amulet can be tough. It's just that's pretty hard ring 2 to take all of this out. So that's probably a lot of damage coming in, but then also back here, an unupgraded Plink has troubles getting through the 2 health, but most anything else in the game doesn't care about 2 versus 1 health, so you can kill the backlane if you have any sort of backlane killing, but if you don't, that is an extra, 8 damage since there's 2 of them, right? So that can make that boss round pretty tough, and they're protected by the boss. So aggressive is the only way this fight I find ever really becomes an issue. Otherwise, the other trials are pretty damn easy, like Mark of Invasion. Who cares about just putting your units in at the bottom, getting 3 damage in? Retribution, just whatever, like who cares? Like, bosses in the front, sure, there's some spikes to get through. It's not really going to be an issue. And then Arbor Emblem as well. It's like, I really don't... You could just let all of them walk on by, and that's less damage to your Pyre than any of the... letting the first 2 waves, like even all of the ring 1 fights pretty much would be more punishing to you than letting those ones through versus these ones through. So that's Pentitent Prayers, pretty dang easy. So then ring 3, the final part of early game, or as I've defined early game. So yeah, take note of which boss you're facing. You can recheck it, of course, if you've forgotten. Hopefully you haven't forgotten, but you're learning the game. It takes a while to really get these practices down. Luckily you can hover back to the bottom of the map, and you're going to see which version of whatever boss you're facing on this ring, because this is the big boss, your first big boss. It's going to be Daedalus or Talos, and there should be a description that basically alludes to which version of either of them you're going to fight. Is it going to be the double explosion type of Daedalus? Is it going to be Talos, the stunner, the pusher? What's it going to be, right? So as far as the map goes, there will always be a concealed cavern in the center, which means you can choose it from either path that you choose. This is going to be your first concealed cavern in the game. Is always on the ring 3. The possibilities of what they can be every single cavern in the game, actually. There's always a chance it could be any possibility there. And then one side will have a banner unit, and the other side, usually, I put that in asterisks here, will be Pyre HP. I don't know what the odds are, but I went through and tried to analyze, because originally I actually said like there will always be Pyre HP, because usually there is, but there's cases where there's not Pyre HP offered, and it's like you just get another banner unit offered. I've seen that happen, but it's rare. I'd say it's like 1 out of 10. I don't know if that's just massive variance that I've encountered, or if that actually is some sort of RNG like that. But I will say I'm pretty sure. I couldn't find any information otherwise, but I think it's basically like it'll usually be there, but sometimes it isn't. But anyway, you're usually incentivized to restore Pyre if you did end up taking a ton of damage. I would say less than 10, maybe 15. I would kind of pigeonhole into taking that Pyre health back. That usually is representing that you can't probably survive all the waves in Ring 3 if you took that much damage already. Try to remember what you did, though. If it was like you took the damage because just the boss got through, that's different than if the waves got through and just kind of ravaged your Pyre. So that's something you gotta take note of. Anyway, though, yeah, on that note, though, if you don't have a tank yet, probably just don't care about the, go for the banner unit, because you're gonna need one here. You can get away with not really having a tank to fight the Ring 2 boss if it wasn't the sweeper version, but you really aren't going to get away with it in Ring 3. You're going to need a tank and you're going to need some sustain, and you're not going to get through 600 health otherwise. Keep in mind, those Ring 3 bosses have 600 HP. It's almost triple, it is triple of the Ring 2 bosses, so it's definitely something to think about. And yeah, if you see a Merchant of Steel, you could try to just make one of your units tanky. That's always an option as well. And we'll get to the specific spells later, but another thing is if you do have like a Wildwood Sap or Flash Freeze or some of these really good boss killing cards, you might want to pigeonhole into a Merchant of Magic just to put like double stack or whatever on it, whatever upgrade makes sense for whatever card you ended up with. Sometimes a Hellvent is also offered here on this ring, and that's really great to get a Wildwood Sap Hellvented. I pretty much would always do that if I had Wildwood Sap, and Wildwood Sap was kind of my game plan to win that early boss. So what can we expect with the boss? Well, one of the variants here is going to be the Daedalus, the Explosive Sigil. That means that basically all these units are just gonna, when they die, do 1 damage to your frontliner. Now, I find this to be the easiest of all the Ring 3 boss variants. If you compare this to the other 2 Daedalus versions, at least, it has an easier mob. Like I'm just skipping ahead here a little bit, but it just seems like what, right? But on top of that, it's like the grenade. The grenade for this one doesn't have double damage. It doesn't have protection, so it's pretty easy to kill if you have any sort of clearing. Even if you don't, it's not as devastating as the double explosion. So basically, all you have to deal with is this 1 damage from the extinguish, but there's plenty of ways to mitigate that. You can simply kill them before you even put your units down. That takes care of a lot of it. If you put your units at the top, you can kill most of these units before they even get there. And that means hardly any of the actual extinguishes are hitting you. And even let's say you did have all of the extinguishes hit you. That's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, 10. We'll say 10 because you're probably not going to kill all the tanks and stuff, but that's 10. That's equal to 1 explosion from a grenade. Whereas the other ones, it's you're probably going to be taking grenade hits from the damage shielded ones, most likely. And if you let one of those double shotted ones, you're taking 20 damage. So I just find overall this is way less devastating than the other Daedalus versions. And like I said, the troops are easy. Just the mob composition, or what am I trying to say? The composition of the mobs is just easier too. For whatever reason, there's only 3 clergymen here. There's just this easy tank with the 2 clergymen behind. Like I said, if you just set up at the top on this fight, most of the strength is already mitigated, right? Because the rage will die out by the time they get up there. by ring 3, you can probably take out 1 health enemies. Really, you just have to take out the grenades when they get there, which should be pretty easy since they have no damage shield on them. And even if you don't kill them, they don't double explode, so it's not the end of the world. So definitely the easiest. Quick note on Daedalus, though. Compared to Talos, he's technically harder. Technically. But in practice, I don't think so. The reason being, yeah, he has 2 extra health, otherwise has this, or 2 extra damage, otherwise has the same health as Talos. But he's not attacking you every turn, and there's nothing you can do really to stop that attack with Talos, save, a few dazed type situations or whatnot. But generally, you're gonna just have to take those hits, and I think that averages out to having, generally the same amount of attack. I would say it almost makes Talos hit you for more damage on average. But anyway, they're both representing a lot of health and a lot of damage. That's why, mainly this health is why you do need those sustained cards like Wildwood Saps or alternatively the Frostbite that just has that damage over time ticking. And even, if you do have, say, Flash Freeze or Titan's Tooth or something, you're kind of incentivized to sometimes just not even fight the mobs and just stick that Frostbite on Daedalus or Talos throughout the fight just to start stacking it. And yeah, sure, maybe you give up some Pyre health, maybe you give up a little bit of health on your tank through those fighting waves, but you'll be better off for it at the end. Just having guaranteed you're killing the boss, because they can get you by surprise. You'd be surprised how hard it is to get through 600 health sometimes. And then we got the double barrel version of Daedalus, very similar to the last troop, except just sort of objectively harder, right? Like, you have an extra clergyman here. The grenades are super devastating if you don't kill them. Instead of 2 clergymen, you have these which don't decay their rage. And then I guess you give up a clergyman for the haste. That's, I don't know. I don't know if that's an up or downgrade. I would say if you're setting up at the top, it's technically more devastating to have these haste up, but it's not too big of a deal. And then this guy hastes on up. I mean, that's still harder than that, but not too big of a deal. Still pretty similar, just harder. And then this version of Daedalus, I would say, just sort of objectively the hardest one. While it's true you're not getting double struck by the grenades, you are getting struck by the grenades, whereas I don't feel with the double striking ones, if you've built correctly or and you didn't super low roll and just like never got any damaging spells, you're probably not really going to take damage from those double exploding barrels. But with these, it's like you have to hit them twice to stop the explosion from happening, and that's a pretty big commitment, especially when you factor in that 2 of these waves punish you for playing spells. So it's like, not only do you not put the damage in on dudes that are gaining attack from you trying to kill the grenades, like you also have like the dudes behind that still shoot you. You still have the same amount of tankiness in front. None of the damage decays, it only grows. Yeah, it's just way harder. There's way more health you have to chunk through. Most of the other stuff was like 1 health dudes. These guys always have a tank. Every single wave has a tank. And almost every single wave, all but 1, have a arrow dude. So it's like, that represents pyre damage. It represents damage to you. It's just objectively the hardest. I don't really get the balance here, but maybe that's how they wanted it. Maybe they wanted like one version to just always be harder. Just maybe that's like a thing. But yeah, that's Daedalus plating. I will say, I'll get to it in the last thing of Talos. I would still rather do this than my most hated version of Talos, which we'll get to soon enough. But here's my favorite version of Talos, Empowering Offense. Just so much easier than the other Talos versions. It's the same troop as the easy Daedalus version, the one with the extinguishes, exactly the same. And the only difference here is, they'll have more rage since they enter with 2 extra rage, right? So they won't actually lose all the rage by the top. But most likely, let's be honest, they're probably just dying by the time they get to the top anyway. If not, the tanks that get the rage in, if you just set up at the top, you literally hard counter her empowering offense. And as for her strike, it's by far the easiest strike to deal with of Talos. It's like, maybe she slays you every now and then. Even if she does, who cares? It's like some extra armor, like 25 armor or something. That's real. I don't think I've ever had a fight where I was like, where she gained enough armor that it was relevant. Usually you can counter that if you're smart, and even if you mess up and let her get the armor, it's not like the other versions, which are literally just like destroy your freaking entire game plan. But yeah, that's Talos the Architect. I guess one thing to note is on the very first round, she'll have 11 instead of the 7 attack, just because she enters with rage as well. Sometimes that can be a problem, but like I said, you should have a good tank by this point in the game, and 7 versus 11, if you have to take a hit here, 7 versus 11 shouldn't be game ending, but it is something to keep in mind. And then the next version we got is a Soul Sucker. Definitely harder than the last one, I think, at least in terms of the slay, the strike effect, but still not anything compared to the next version, but we'll get to that later. So it's still that kind of the double exploding. Daedalus has the same mob as this. It's pretty similar to the last one as well, just sort of a little bit harder, and just kind of similar to the last version of Talos. This version of Talos is a little bit harder. Sap 1, it doesn't mean anything. Similar to the Rage, I don't think it's ever really relevant. I messed up the picture here. That should read 2 on here, but whatever. Anyway, the dazed on strike, it can be annoying, but it's only really annoying if you really relied on your frontliner to deal damage by this point. Hopefully by this point, your tank is your tank and somebody else can deal your damage. But, even if that isn't the case, it just means you're going to take some pyre damage. It doesn't really mean you're going to die, because there just isn't a whole... If you're set up at the top, there's not a whole lot of damage coming in other than the second wave, right? Otherwise you should be fine as long as you had a little bit of pyre health buffer space. You should be able to beat it as long as you have that good sustain and whatnot. And then we get to the final one, I like to call her the Seraph, the Patient of Talos's. Talos the Balanced, aka the Protective Sin version. So much harder than the other versions of Talos. I don't know what they were thinking with this one, but whatever. I have a very special spot of hatred in my heart for this version of Talos, just because I've had so many freaking streaks snapped by this boss. But whatever. Why is she harder? Well, we've already talked about how this sort of enemy composition is objectively harder than the other two, right? So this is matching the hard version of Daedalus, the plated version. And what about the unit effect? So the other one, 2 rage, 1 sap. This one gets 5 armor. I'm sorry, but 5 armor is so much more impactful than all those other ones, especially when you factor in that there's so many of these freaking arrow dudes, right? That means that before, on all these other troops, like I can take all of these out with the unupgraded Glimmer. I can take them out with Plink. I can take them out with Torch. I can take them out with Vent on 1 energy or something. I can take them out with even a Molting Imp or something. A Molting Imp doesn't even take them out here. Like the 5 armor is so impactful, so much more impactful than a measly 2 rage or a measly 1 sap when you come in. Give me a break, right? So yeah. And to make matters worse, just to rub salt in the wound, she gets to get that 5 armor too. That's bullshit. But anyway, on top of that, if that wasn't bad enough, right? Her strike is so much more devastating than all the other ones. Pushing your freaking units, she's the only thing in the game that does this. It's crazy. Like, you basically, even if you have a good tank here, it can still screw you. You have to game plan even that much more against this version of Talos, because sometimes there just isn't anything you can do. Like, to mitigate her strike effect. You know, if you ended up with a tank, a DPS, and maybe you have, I don't know, your champ, maybe you got like Tethys or something, like you can only do so much to mitigate it. It's like you can put units in front, but as we've said, they've got 5 armor and they have a lot of damage coming in. You know, once your units, you could try to be fancy and put your non-tank in front in hopes that you can last it out and get that unit pushed back and still survive. That's pretty hard to pull off though, especially when, you know, these units have 5 armor, and that's a lot of, you know, it's a lot of damage coming in on top of the 7 here, right? So it's like 7 plus 5 is going to be 12 plus 2, most likely 3 to 4. You know, you're looking at 15 damage coming in. And maybe even more sometimes, and that's pretty freaking hard to have your non-tank take. You know, they're just gonna die. So, you know, a great way to get around this, if you have 2 banner units and one of them's more of like a DPS type unit, just stick 25 health if you can find it. Let's say you had a Frost Shark and you had like a nameless Siren. And you find a 25 health upgrade, and you know this is the version of Talos coming up, you might be inclined just to put the health on the Siren, even though you would have rather had it on the Titan in the grand scheme of things. For this particular fight, it'd serve you better to just get health on both of them, because you don't know how it's going to shake out. You can try your best to predict which floor she's going to go to, but it's actually not 100% predictable. She might go up, she might go down. When she gets to the end, she might go all the way back up. She might, you know, it's not actually, I used to think it was predictable. It actually isn't. So you can try to hedge your bets, but you never know exactly what's going to happen. You never know exactly where she's going to go. And that can really screw over your game plan. And that's all I got to say about that. This is a tough one. You know, that's actually not all I have to say about it. There's a few other things too. A few other tricks I've learned along the way. So if you have Awoken, a unupgraded Vine Grasp will do wonders in this fight to use on your own units. If you're Hellhorned, a March of Shields will do wonders here. You know, anything that can refix your line will do wonders here, and that's fine. I mean, honestly, those are the only 2 spells probably, but most people know about March of Shields, but I think people forget about Vine Grasp, that you can use it on your own units. I know I forget it a lot, but that can save your run. You know, if you get your squisher unit put to the front, you can just hit your tank with 3 damage and pull them right back to the front, and that'll fix this fight pretty well in your favor. But, you know, if you have enough sustain, you have enough regen, frostbite, lifesteal, you know, armor, those type of sustain things, if you can stick them on whatever unit ends up surviving, however it shakes out, that's going to be how you're going to be able to beat this boss. Rant over. And yeah, let's talk about some of these trials a little bit more. So trials, you know, I listed generally for those earlier mobs what would be an easier or a tough trial, but it's still all very, very variant on what your deck is. It's very variant on what your clan combo is, what your champ is. It's hard to really give an evaluation for all of them. Those are just my general baselines for those. You know, for instance, like Tethys really doesn't like to see spikes most of the time. I would say I would be super hesitant with Tethys to take spikes. Same with like Hellhorned, certain variants of the Hellhorned Prince, like especially the Slay version. You know, he doesn't have any armor. He needs to slay things. Like his low health of like 6 or whatever is going to have a rough time with spikes, unless you have some serious armor cards. But you know, if you're like Sentient, yeah, you don't care about spikes. You can take spikes on pretty much everything, and it won't matter. You know, any sort of tanky champ really doesn't care about spikes. So you know, every champ has their own thing, and it'll be obvious. You know, do you have health or do you not have health? And that's gonna see if you can take spikes on or not. And then conversely, with like armor, if you don't have quick scaling or big damage, and it's one of those fights where like there's a bow and arrow dude or a crossbow dude in the back with 10 armor behind the boss, you might have a rough time with 10 armor. Otherwise, if you have like an upgraded glimmer, you don't really care about 10 armor. You're going to kill everything in the game in these first 3 rings with an upgraded glimmer, right? Or even an upgraded like vent or something like that. And yeah, you don't have to take these trials. Also remember that, like, I think, especially if you came from like games like Slay the Spire, you might be conditioned, like I was honestly, to always have to play so close to the wire, right? You just don't have to do that with Monster Train. That's the beauty of this game. You can skip a lot of trials and still be very comfortable in this game. So don't reach if you don't have to. And really the main time I would reach, especially in these first rings, is just to get a tank. Or if you're fighting Talos the Balanced, maybe you get 2 tanks. You know, you might just add 2 tanks temporarily just to get around that fight. That's an option too. Yeah. Or, you know, if you really need like holdover or something and it's a gold trial, maybe I'll reach there. But if I don't have a real good reason to take, you know, to get the reward I'm being offered, and I'm kind of iffy on if I can take the trial or not, just don't take it. Just don't take it. You're not really going to miss out hugely by skipping trials. I think that's maybe something that doesn't get said much in a lot of advice, I feel. But I'm telling you right now, I lose way more by taking a trial I shouldn't have versus skipping a trial and just like missing out on some gold or a unit or something. I can definitely point to many more times I've lost because I took a trial when I shouldn't have. And and then just quick note, I think I mentioned all this before, but the spike trial is 3 spikes. The armor one is 10 armor. It also applies to the bosses for whatever reason, while all these other ones don't. 4 attack for the attack one, and then the invasion is 3 clergymen on the top and 4 in the middle. And speaking of that, yeah, 3 in the top, 4 in the middle. Generally for tanky champs, they're not going to have a problem with this one because they're just going to be able to survive that initial pain, and then there's really not much more that this mark gives you, or this trial. You know, this trial doesn't actually do anything for the enemies beyond that first set of waves. But yeah, for squishy champs, it could be an issue, especially with the Gathered Clergy as like the actual fight, because then you don't have a safe floor to really come in on. So you really have to gauge, like, do I have enough AoE or torches, plinks, whatnot. And that's really, I guess, what all these points here. And also, this last point, I typically want to kill the units at the top if I can, because that's really the only ones that are going to damage your pyre. So, you know, it's the 3 at the top. If all 3 get through, that's going to be 9 damage to your pyre. Everyone you kill is going to be 3 less. But if you let all the middle 4 through, they only do 1 damage by the time they get up there. So that's only 4 damage. Like, you know, killing 3 of the middle floor is equivalent to killing 1 of the top floor in terms of saving pyre damage. So that's something to think about too. Aggressive Amulet, 4 damage to all enemy units. You know, similar to the last trial, that Mark of Invasion, you know, any sort of AoE damage or targeted damage is not going to have an issue with this trial. Really, the main thing with Aggressive Amulet is these freaking crossbow dudes. It's like, if you foresee them being a problem, this trial will make them much more of a problem. So, especially on those ones where they're behind the boss. So, you know, if you don't have, you know, if you're starting like Umbra, the classic Umbra, and say Melting Remnant, you know, two clans that don't actually have some targeted things like Torch and Plink and whatnot, and if you didn't get a starting card, you know, one of those additional starting cards that can deal with that, you might not want to take Aggressive Amulet in those type of scenarios. You're gonna have to really think about that. Like, can you take on the boss with a 9 damage dude, adding damage in each turn? That could be pretty brutal, right? And especially in the second ring, if you've lost some Pyre health already, if you're like in the 25 or below range, make sure you think you can kill all the units before taking this, because that second ring, when those units get through at +4 damage, that could really hurt your Pyre. And if you go into that ring 3 fight without much Pyre health, that can pretty much spell defeat in most cases. Not always. I mean, I've definitely survived off literally 1 HP and gotten through, but I wouldn't make that my game plan, let's put it that way. Not worth a trial to go down that low in HP. I'd much rather just have buffer room. That's worth more to me than gold in most cases. Maybe not worth more to me than a banner unit if I needed a banner unit. If I already have a banner unit, I almost never take banner unit trials. But anyway, Retribution, this is the spikes one. 3 spikes. Only really a problem when you got those squishy champs like Tethys, or if you're relying on a squishy banner unit. Otherwise, it's really not an issue. 3 spikes early game for any amount of tanky banner units or champs. That's just like tickling them. It's really not that bad. If you can't kill all the units, it's a little bit of extra damage to your Pyre. I mean, it's a decent amount, but it's not as bad as the 4 damage that the other one gives you. It's 3 versus 4, so I guess not like it's still a lot of damage, but I don't know, not as punishing, I would say. And also, any sort of heals or HP stat buffs are gonna further make spikes a cakewalk. You can even like something like Hellhorned Prince, the slave version who has 6 health. If you got consistent heal, you can still take this. You can just heal back. As long as you're healing through those first 2 waves, you're going to be fine. And then finally, we got the Armor Emblem. In a general sense, I do think this is the hardest one. It nullifies most of your basic starting cards that are AoE or kind of randomized damage like Plink and whatnot, or targeted damage like Torch and whatnot, or even like a Vine Grasp or something. Even though the Vine Grasp will pull them forward, it still doesn't like kill the unit, so they're still going to get damage in. And yeah, 10 armor is a lot. You need upgrades, particularly in the first fight, where you have no chance of getting an upgrade. It's just pretty brutal. And as I've said, these crossbow dudes, they just do so much. They do so much to you if you can't take them out. And if they're behind the boss and you don't have 10 damage AoE or targeted damage, yeah, it's going to be, it's not the 9 damage that the other one represents, so it's 5, so it's not as bad. But I think the difference there is, like, I can usually kill the unit in the aggressive amulet situation, because all I need is like a Plink or a Torch, whereas like here, I can't typically kill him, right? Like a Plink's not going to kill him, a Torch isn't going to kill him. They're just going to add that 5 damage in each time, so definitely consistently more hard, I would say. So I talked about boss killing cards, right? Sustain or otherwise, just things that help with specifically killing those early bosses. And this is kind of my prime list here that you need to be targeting for each clan. Wildwood, Sap, and Flash Freeze we've definitely talked about enough. When you got the regen, it just represents so much extra health over a relentless fight. Now, typically you want more than one of these. If you get it, really try to either double stack it, Eternal Stone it, or Hellvent it. Either one of those is going to go a long way to helping kill that boss. Just having one of them might not be enough. Flash Freeze, on the other hand, doesn't really need the TLC that Wildwood Sap does. It doesn't really need any upgrades. It doesn't even necessarily need to be duplicated. Certainly doesn't need to be like double stacked, but they're all things that you can do if you needed to do it, right? But I really like Flash Freeze. It's really versatile. You can use it to kill units, but you can also just, throughout the entire fight, you can be stacking that on the bosses. Those Ring 3 bosses are there for the whole fight, so you can just keep stacking it on them, and that's a lot of damage over the course of, at least, you get 6 waves to go through in the initial fight, and then you also got the Relentless rounds, which will go however long, and that's just so much damage over time. Spike the Stygian, similarly, you're going to add Frostbite, but also Sap, unlike Flash Freeze, with Flash Freeze you're kind of just putting it in the whole fight. Spike likes to be applied right before the Relentless rounds. That way you get that extra sap. The Frostbite's just kind of nice to have, but couple that with the sap, those first few attacks they do just don't do anything, and it usually buys you an extra 3 to 4 rounds of the Relentless round, and that's going to go pretty good ways toward helping to kill those bosses. Remnant Pack's a little different story. I thought about listing like reform cards as well, but I think by Ring 3 it's just pretty hard to get a consistent reform package that I didn't necessarily want to list it as a target path here. It is a viable path, but it's much easier just to get something like Remnant Pack, or even like an endless upgrade on your units at the Merchant of Steel. What that allows you to do is to drop in at the bottom floor, and you can stick this on any sort of tanky unit, and that represents a lot of extra damage that you can fight all 3 floors on. You know, think about like a Frost Shark. If it's endless, it applies all that Frostbite, and then you get to basically play it again on the next floor. All that Frostbite is still applied, and it just keeps stacking and stacking. It also takes several hits to kill the Frostbite Shark again. Then it dies, you go all the way up another floor. It got a ton of Frostbite, but this time you're pretty much guaranteed to beat even these 600 HP bosses at that point. And then Drain, kind of the same thing as Spike. You want to play it right before the end, but you can, if you have a few of these for whatever reason, you can just stack them throughout the fight as well. It can actually sap Talos enough. So sap 3, if you were to double stack this, sap 6, that's minus 12 damage. That's enough that's a viable way to basically counter her strike entirely, right? So not only is she now not getting to do the pushback or the stun, which is already huge, but come the time for her fight, she'll probably still be sapped, especially if you can apply it again, and that pretty much guarantees victory. Titan's Tooth, same kind of story as Flash Freeze. I guess if you have the discard package, it's even less awkward than Flash Freeze. Like, you don't even have to really make too many decisions with it. It's like, usually Talos might just be on the floor that you want to play it on anyway, so you kill the wave, and it's just a nice have to like stack the Frostbite on the Talos as well. Or Daedalus, like if you're using it to kill a grenade and whatnot. Titan's Tooth's just a very good card in general at all stages in the game. And then Immortal Trade is very similar to Wildwood Sap. But it's also, you can keep stacking it throughout the fight if you have an Ember Drain package. Even if you don't, it's not a whole lot of Ember Drain. Like, you can survive playing it early just to get some lifesteal stacking. And you'll usually, you can clear the Ember Drain and just keep playing it. By the time you play it again, you might have 2 of these cards or whatever, but you can kind of just keep stacking lifesteal, and if you have enough lifesteal, you're obviously going to have no problem at all killing these bosses. That represents a ton of sustain. Razor Sharp Edge, nothing really to do with sustain necessarily, but what it does is it greatly cuts down how much rounds you have to sustain. I thought about putting even a card like Sharpen on, but I thought against it simply because I would compare it against like Razor Sharp Edge, and Razor Sharp Edge just outshines it entirely. If you think about it, Daedalus, using Daedalus or Talos as an example, they only attack you once, and so a Sharpen adds you essentially 4 extra damage and on your frontliner, right? And only on the frontliner, because it won't really work on a backliner that doesn't have much health. So Sharpen has to be on someone with a lot of extra health, whereas Razor Sharp Edge, it could go on the tank or it could go on your squishy backliner, right? It has that flexibility. It also is half the Ember cost. And the 2 max health I find is usually irrelevant, but the 10 extra damage completely outshines the 4 extra damage plus the 4 spikes. It's actually does more damage on top of all that. So Razor Sharp Edge is just the way to go. And then it's just a better card in general. Not in just an additional nice thing is you can use it to kill enemy units, which especially in the Daedalus fight is actually pretty relevant. This thing can cut right through one of those plated armor grenades, right? Then we got Engulfed in Smoke. This one is similar to Spike Drain, where it's much better if you play it right before those relentless rounds. You know, you could permafrost it to guarantee that. You could also double stack it to give 4 stealth. You know, buying 4 extra rounds is pretty dang good. That's usually all that you're getting when you put a bunch of regen in, is just extra rounds, right? So stealth just kind of does that unconditionally, and that's pretty good. Mortal Entrapment is I don't want to give the false impression that I think this is a good card by any means. I think it's one of the crappier cards in the game, but at least it has moments where it can shine, and this early boss is certainly one of them. You're probably going to have some damage on Talos or Daedalus at some point before these relentless rounds, and at some point you can basically just play this either right before the relentless round, or you can just kind of stack it over time. Either way, you can stack some days. I don't really care about the damage at all. It's attuned. I kind of feel like that's a noob trap. If anything, the only reason this is good is because of the dazed, and you can certainly use that to buy you a bunch of extra turns, and that might be what you need. Sometimes, you know, you might have a good deck going, but you don't have any good ways to kill the boss, and you get offered some crappy card like this, but hey, it does the job. Take it, and that'll allow you to beat that first boss, and you probably never use it again throughout the rest of the run, and that's fine. It kind of did its job, and you'll win. And then Tireless Climb, pretty similar. It's like you can use it at any point to stack dazed. You could even do weird, like let's say in a scenario where like Seraph the Patient is in your future, I would even hunt for holdover on this, because it'll be useful come Seraph the Patient. And then if you're fighting against any of these bosses, particularly Talos the Pusher, but any version of Talos, you can put this on holdover, and she'll never hit you again. Sure, you're gonna have to spend the Ember to play it, but I could sacrifice some Pyre health, some unit health, to pretty much guarantee the victory on the boss. I mean, if you stack days enough, there's no way the boss can kill you, right? So that's kind of a good selection of boss killing spells, I would say. And then we get to the boss killing tanks. You know, anything will work, of course. If you have a Merchant of Steel and you have a plus 25 health, plus whatever, anything can work, but these are kind of what you want to be looking for. So nothing can really beat, in my opinion, Crucible Collector. It is just this unit that doesn't require any upgrades at all to be your carry. I can't say that about too many units. All you have to do is feed it some morsels, and you don't even have to feed it that many. It completely gets its entire health back. It doesn't, you know, I like Crucible Warden a lot too, but unlike Crucible Warden, it doesn't lose like stacks of lifesteal while it's getting pounded by little minion waves, whereas Crucible Warden will. Crucible Warden requires a lot more morsel support compared to Crucible Collector. You just have a Crucible Collector, you have some morsels. As long as your Pyre health has some buffer room, you're never going to have a problem just having Crucible Collector in your deck, because it's pretty much the best boss killing unit in the game, in my opinion. It used to be, I felt that way about Thorn Hollow, but ever since Awoken now has Root Seeds, it's like, I don't know. I find without the basic regen card, Thorn Hollow is like significantly worse. So it really depends on which version of Awoken you get, but that's one thing I will say with Crucible Collector and Crucible Warden is like, at least Plink is still relevant at this point in the game. So you either got Plink or you got the other, whatever the morsel making card is for the classic Umbra. Even if you didn't get like Antumbra Assault or anything, you at least have those, and those are honestly usually enough just to feed these units. So there's really no situation they're necessarily bad. Although Crucible Warden would probably like some extra morsel generation. The reason I would rate them higher than like the Hollows is that Hollows do need regen to be good. Otherwise, they're a 3 pip, like 15 health unit. That's not that good, right? you really need heals and regen to make these work. So they're a little bit more situational. But if you have those situations, it's hard to beat the boss killing potential that the hollows give. You know, they have so much health. If you can put some rejuve bombs on them, or even like, you know, just stack some regen, and they're getting these procs of the rejuvenate on each heal that you play, and then each stack of rejuve every turn that happens, and it continues into the relentless rounds. So pretty good units. Titan Sentry, I kind of talked about them earlier, but another one of those just god tier units. Definitely will get you through that early game. Kind of the gold standard Titan Sentry upgrades are 25 health and the Endless upgrade. Particularly just the Endless upgrade, though. If you can get that Endless upgrade, you can almost just kill the boss alone with just Titan Sentry, even the 600 HP bosses. Like, he's putting in damage through the waves because it's AoE, and come the relentless rounds, if it's endless and you put them at the bottom, you can play them on all 3 floors. It's a lot of frostbite stacked, especially if you have that extra 25 health on top of it. Just a really good unit. Siren of the Sea is really nice. Obviously, you want to focus on incanting her as much as possible, but if you do that, you almost don't need, you can get by without initial upgrade, but certainly if you have some health upgrades or the armor incant upgrade, any one of those is going to make her an incredible tank. And in the same sense, Guardian of the Named, if Siren of the Sea is good at tanking, Guardian of the Named is even that much better, because he actually gains an extra armor compared to the 2 health. Now, granted, if you have heals, I'd still say Siren of the Sea shines more as a tank, even if she didn't gain damage. But she gains damage on top of that, so that just makes her that much better. But that's not a knock against Guardian Unnamed. Guardian Unnamed is still amazing. It's just that Siren of the Sea is just so god tier of a unit. Now, Wickless Baron needs a little bit more situation. Like, I would say if you're Stygian, you can pretty much always incant. Like, there's not really too many situations where you can't. I would say as Melting Remnant, there are situations where Harvest isn't really viable, but it's rare. I think most of the time it's viable, and especially if you can get some tomb units, you're going to be sitting pretty nice with Wickless Baron. Other than that, if you started with Drags, those are good. Drafts are always good as well. Any sort of 1 pip low health unit as a sacrifice to Wickless is going to give him a lot of health. And obviously if you have like AoE clear that you can play the same floor and moment that they meet Wickless Baron, that's going to be a lot of extra health. And then similar to Siren of the Sea, he's gaining damage as well, so it just makes it that many less turns you actually have to sustain through, because he's actually supplying damage as well. Lady of the Reformed starts with 40 health. That alone is kind of great, but she also has the advantage of like, she'll never run out of burnout unless for whatever reason she's not getting hit. But since she gets hit, gains a burnout every hit, like she'll never actually lose her burnout. So she'll sustain through all of it, but then she also adds sustain to units that otherwise wouldn't have it. And those units that wouldn't have it usually are statted such that allowing them to sustain through a whole fight, using like a draft as an example, you have 2 drafts behind her. That's a lot of damage that represents. So a little situational in that she really shines, obviously, if you have burnout units behind, but even if you don't, it doesn't actually apply the burnout to the other non-burnout units, so it's still just a good tank to have. Like 40 health at 2 pip is, you'll notice there's not actually another unit on here that matches that, just in a general sense. Like Lady of the House has 40, but she doesn't gain burnout on getting hit, right? But I still listed her because she's still a pretty good tank. If you have any amount of reform, you can keep reforming her. So similar to Titan Sentry, it's like that's just a lot of extra damage. But I would generally prefer Lady of the Reform. I kind of listed it as like the top row here is my like S tier. I didn't really label it, but then down here is kind of a more situational tier or just not as good tier, but still fine. We talked about the hollows. Big Sludge, not really a tank I didn't know what to say about Big Sludge. I felt like I had to list him because it's like, if you have any amount of good harvest to do, there's not many bosses that can survive him. And especially if you kind of built him as a tank, like just gave him health, he'll have enough sustain and he'll be doing 100 damage. You know, Rage 5, that's every harvest he's gaining 10 damage essentially. There's not really that much decay going on. And yeah, it's not out of the question he gets to 100 damage. And so, you know, you figure the enemy does 7 or 9 damage. All you at 100 damage, you only have to hit him 6 times. You know, if you have extra 25 health and he didn't take much hits throughout the fight, that's alone is enough to kill the boss. Then Railbeater and Steelworker, they're kind of pretty mediocre units in my opinion. I probably would prefer Railbeater just because, you know, if we're talking about boss killing, it's not necessarily always geared just toward the Ring 3 boss. You know, we can talk about the Ring 2 boss as well, especially like the Sweeper. In those, Railbeater definitely outshines Steelworker because there's only, three waves. So, you know, let's say you get Steelworker on turn 1. By the 4th wave, he'll have gained like 20 armor. Which is already not at the 30. If you put him at the very top floor, then maybe you get to 30 armor. So you'd have to draw him in the opener and play him at the top just to match what Railbeater already gets in terms of armor. And then Railbeater also, just on top of that, has a better like strike, like pushing the unit to the back is generally beneficial, I would say, especially in those first rings, where a lot of those you have like a non-damage dealing shield dude in front. It's like, since the Railbeater's the tank, they'll hit first, push them out of the way, and then you can clean up and kill all the backline units after that. But that being said, both of them are tanky. Not as nearly as great as any of these other ones, but they are options for tank if you need them. Sometimes you get stuck going the Hellhorned Banner unit route, and these are going to be probably your best tank options. Because unlike something like Demon Fiend, you know, you can actually play these guys. Crazy concept, I know. And then Husk Hermit, similar to these, it's like not a great option at tank, but it can work. 30 health is respectable. It provides some sweeping damage, which helps with killing the backline. Maybe you end up putting a quick on him or something along with health. Quick, in a way, is almost like adding health because it greatly reduces the incoming amount of damage. But not my first choice for a tank, but definitely an option, right? Like if you didn't get offered anything better, Husk can work. I've definitely used him as my tank throughout the entire game, and in a lot of my Covenant 25 wins. And then just a few support units here I figured were worth calling out. Guardian Stone is going to go a long way to adding some sustain because it goes to your whole floor, right? Not just your frontliners. So on top of just making your frontliner more tanky, it really helps with the sustain because say you had like a Nameless Siren just at 10 health, you know, you incant 10, 15 times with this thing. You added an extra 15 health. Well, that's an extra maybe 2 strikes and the boss, and maybe your Siren's doing 60 damage by then. So that's an extra 120 damage that's just earned you against the boss. So, and that's just kind of one example, you know. There's a wide range of what Guardian Stone might end up doing for you. And then even in a more greater sense, you got Lodestone Totem. Like if you can manage to sap the boss a few times, like Lodestone Totem isn't quite as insane early game as it is in the mid to late game, just because you don't really have quite the ability to spam out spells as much. But if you do, you know, say you do 3, you know, 3 is already -6 damage, and then that's -6 damage that becomes -4 damage next turn, -2 damage next turn. That's like still like a definite form of sustain that's pretty good. And you can get more, you know, it's not uncommon even in the first few rings to sap a boss for 10 or so. If you do that, you're pretty much going to win at 10 sap. Shard Channeler, obviously situational that you're using like Thorned Hollow or maybe the Spike version of Sentient, or maybe Spike plus Revenge Path on Hellhorn Prince. Those would probably be the 3 common reasons I would say you'd have Shard Channeler. If you have them, it just literally halves the amount of time you need to fight to win the Relentless rounds in a general sense, because it's pretty much doubling how much damage you do with your spikes. And then Welder Helper provides a lot of armor to your frontliner, and not only that, you have the option of putting it on Endless, right? Or if you're like melting Remnant, you can reform it and stuff. And if you do that, it's not like the worst thing in the world to help with beating these first few bosses, even if you don't end up using it that much later on in the run. Like if you can, if you're Hellhorned and you have the torch, you can kill it pretty consistently, just torching your own dude. That's an extra 20 armor per turn. That's at least 2 extra hits that you get to survive against the boss. So that'll go a long way toward helping you beat the boss. And then Molten Encasement, pretty much just the same idea as whatever, I forget the name of it, but Engulfed in Smoke. Just the same idea. If you have the pit space to make it work, you could similarly as Welder Helper put it on Endless, and you're going to stack so much stealth by the end of the fight that by the time Relentless comes around, you might have 10 stealth or so. Like, you think about it, there's 6 waves or whatever. Wouldn't be that out of the question to have at least had him die through, I guess 10's maybe out of the question because you're going to be burning stealth through that. But I don't know, maybe you get 6 stealth or something. That wouldn't be too out of the question. And that's 6 rounds that just bought you against the boss, so that's pretty good. Quick notes on Merchant of Steel. I'm mainly talking about it just in regards to the boss. Taking on that 3rd ring boss, like what you're kind of looking out for here. So obviously 25 health is going to be a godsend. Same if you have Stygian, that gain armor too is probably even better than this. Goddamn iTunes. And those are the primo. If you can't find them, Battlestone's not horrible either. It's certainly not as enticing, but a little bit of extra damage, a little bit extra health, it's not bad. That's pretty flexible. And it also makes it so, like, say you have like a Siren of the Sea or something, it allows it to fill its role for this early fight, and then you can transition it to be whatever you want to after the fight come mid to late game. Maybe you determine it's going to be your tank, and you just, you add an armor thing to it or another health thing to it later. Or maybe you determine it's your DPS and you add a front multi-strike to it later. You have Battlestone allows that flexibility. Large Stone, you're going to have to make a judgment call on this one. I am not a huge fan of Large Stone, I think, compared to what most people think of this one, but definitely it's certainly a great option if you need it to take on this first boss. That extra amount of stats it provides is pretty insane. It can maybe screw up your game plan for the mid to late game because that extra pip space can put a damper in what your kind of end game plan was. But sometimes you have to sacrifice a little of your late game just to get through the early game. And if I foresee that I'm just gonna struggle, like say Talos the Pusher is in my future, I might just slap Large Stone on something just to try to have a really good fighting chance of beating her. Because Large Stone, it's hard to beat Large Stone in the early game. That's just so much extra stats, and the pip space that it takes up, at least for the 3rd ring boss, probably doesn't mean too much. Like, you don't really need to build an ideal floor in those fights. What you just need is like one good unit and a few good spells, and that's really it. And when we talked about Endless, really good on Frost Shark, but really anything. Like, it's very situational. You don't want it on everything, but you could put it on a lot of utility units like we talked about as well, like Welder Helper or some tomb units. You could even stick it on like a Remnant Host if you're going the Harvest route, like a Wickless Baron. If you have a Remnant Host on Endless with Wickless Baron, you're going to beat the boss, probably no problem. You're gonna have a lot of scaling there. And then multi-strike, you know, obviously nothing helping with the tank, but it's always going to be good. I wouldn't put it on my tank unless for whatever reason my tank could justify it. Usually it's going on my backliner, but you know, it's worth noting, you know, if you have an alright tank, adding multi-strike to your backliner just cuts down the amount of sustain you actually have to have, usually by around half, roughly speaking, depending on how good your backliner is. That's kind of the Merchant of Steel. And then moving on to the Merchant of Magic, particularly, again, focused on beating that boss. Double stack is going to be very powerful for that. It allows you to basically do a 2-in-1, you know, make a very highly impactful play. There's only 6 waves you're going through, so you don't have much time to do much, right? But anyway, double stack on Wildwood Sap is a great combo, you know, great thing to do. Usually I double stack it and then reduce the Ember, so it still costs 1, but I get 10 regen. 10 regen goes a really long ways toward helping the sustain, you know, that you think about it, it's like, it's almost as if, let's say you had a unit that had 20 health, right? Let's say that 20 health unit now has 10 regen on it. And let's say you're fighting Daedalus, who does 9 damage per hit. So, first hit, he hits you, you go back to 20, you're at full health. So it's like it would be the same as if you had 29 health. Let's say he hits you again, you go back to 20 health. That'd be the same as if you had 38 health. Hits you again, now you go back to 19, that's the same. Now that's what, 9 times 3, 24, you know, so on and so forth. It's like adding a simple 10 regen was almost like adding frickin' 50 health to your character or something crazy like that, right? I don't know the exact math, but you can kind of get a picture. In a similar sense, Immortal Trade's the same way. It's like basically like pseudo adding a ton of health to your frontliner. You know, it's 3 lifesteal is a pretty good amount to get. I find Wildwood Sap and Immortal Trade are they shine a lot in the early game. Not necessarily so great in the late game, but definitely good in the early game. Wildwood Sap can continue to be good in the late game if you're a regen centric build, but that may or not be the may or may not be your game plan. The thing to remember with Wildwood Sap is it's always going to be good for those first few bosses, and you don't have to really focus on it after that. I'd say most of the time I add it, I'm not really making it my main game plan for my mid to late game, but it's just signed so well in the early game that you want to snag one if you see it. Almost over anything, I would say, if you see Wildwood Sap. You know, and it's another great thing about Wildwood Sap is there's that cavern event where you can get a random consumable. If you see Awoken as a choice, you should take that because it's almost always Wildwood Sap. I'll have another guide at some point on caverns, but that's just something to keep in mind there. And all these other ones, you know, just double, you know, not much to say there. Double it, and it's going to be really good. And then Holdover, I think I've done Flash Freeze on Holdover, and it's surprisingly good, especially for that early game. Being able to play it every turn, you can use it to kill backliners, you can use it to kill tanks, or you can just stack it on the boss. It's entirely flexible in what you can do. You can even kill your own unit in weird cases. Like you want to kill your own little Fade? Sure, do it. It's very flexible. And in Engulfed in Smoke, maybe even better than double stacking it is holding it over. I mean, if you play it every turn, yeah, you're using most of your Ember into it, but you're pretty much guaranteeing that you're going to kill the boss at that point. Yeah, who cares about Talos the Pusher, Talos the Stunner if they can't hit your guys the entire fight, right? And I'll just sacrifice some pair health. Sure, maybe I didn't play a few spells to kill the units, but those units, you know, as long as I have the pyre health to justify that, I'm pretty much guaranteeing my victory by stacking this every turn. Same with Tireless Climb, it's the same idea there. Probably not even as good as Engulfed in Smoke, but as long as you're stacking it on the enemy boss, they're going to have so much daze by the time they fight you that you're just going to win. And then Razor Sharp Edge is just so much extra stats. To be able to play that every turn, that's a good play as well. And then Permafrost, there's a few of these that are just, they particularly shine when you play them right before the boss. Immortal Trade is a great one to permafrost. If you can somehow manage to get both double stack and permafrost, it's the best, I think. Because the problem with double stacking Immortal Trade is it does double stack the Ember Drain. And at 4 Ember Drain, you're not going to play cards for probably 2 turns. Most likely 2 turns afterward. But if you permafrost it and double stack it, you can pretty much say, like, okay, right before the boss, I'm going to add 6 lifesteal. That's essentially like adding 6 stealth, if you think about it. And in the same sense, if you want to permafrost stealth, might as well do that. And then Spike of the Stygian. It's just one of those cards we talked about that is so much better when you play it right before the Relentless rounds. Get that sap in, stack some Frostbite, let it all play out over several Relentless rounds. Then Mortal Entrapment really likes to see permafrost, I suppose. I mean, they're definitely going to be damaged by the time those Relentless rounds come around. And if you can stack 3 days right before your Relentless round, that's 3 extra turns you just bought you. It's pretty good. And then for Remove Consume, I only really put Wildwood Sap here. Most of the other cards listed here aren't really consumable. The ones that are, like Spike the Stygian, I don't think it's worth it to make this have to require an extra energy of you. Whereas with Wildwood Sap, I think it is worth it just to be able to replay it. Generally with Wildwood Sap, what I would be doing is reducing the Ember back down to 1 and then making it Eternal Stoned. You could technically do that with Spike of the Stygian as well. I just don't find that Spike of the Stygian has as much benefit to sort of play multiple times as Wildwood Sap does. With Wildwood Sap, it's like you do want to be stacking that regen throughout the whole fight, and it's more beneficial throughout most of the fight than Spike of the Stygian, whereas like Spike of the Stygian is more kind of benefiting you just in those Relentless rounds. And that's kind of the Merchant of Magic. That's getting kind of the end of this guide. Just some closing remarks here. Just to reiterate, I've probably belabored this point, but try to secure the tank first. The DPS, I call them DPS, but there's you're not on a timer in this game. The backline glass cannon damage dealers, they're sexy. Animus Will is sexy. Nameless Siren is sexy, but take the tank first. If you don't have a tank, don't go reaching for one of those if you see a tank alongside it. I mean, if you see it and there's no better choices, sure, take them, but get the tank first. That's what you're going to need to win the early game. And it's also the one you need to upgrade early to win the early game. But yeah, once you have your tank, don't neglect getting a backliner, because now if you get that Animus Will, you get that Nameless Siren behind your good tank, it's usually going to cut down the sustain by around half as many rounds as you need to go through. And also, I think I touched on this before, but there's always going to be this balance of like securing your early game versus still trying to find answers for Seraph, because like sometimes cards will come around where it's like, oh shit, like if I get that, I know I'm going to beat Seraph, right? Like Seraph the Patient, if I can secure a silence, that would go a long way to do that. But we also know Unnamed Tome isn't particularly that impactful in the early game, right? So let's say you see it alongside like a Wildwood Sap. What do, right? You have to make that judgment call. The greedy play is to take the silence. Sometimes greedy is correct in a card game, right? But you do really have to learn how to evaluate those type of things. Like, do I need this Wildwood Sap? A lot of times the safe bet there, by the way, would be to take the Wildwood Sap. If you're in doubt, lean toward the immediate need versus the end game need. You can kick yourself later for not getting the silence, but trust me, it's more painful just to lose outright. Seraph the Patient is notorious for this, by the way, because he requires so many answers. Part of the reason he'll beat you is just because you die taking and reaching for things that won't help you in the immediate just to win that end game. Try not to fall into that trap too much. And the last remark I have here is, and I've most of these are just reiterations, but it is, as long as you have some Pyre buffer health room, especially on like the third ring boss, I would say it's preferable just to let them hit your Pyre. If you think it's going to be a close fight, I would just let them hit the Pyre and focus on purely preparing for killing the boss. That might mean just throwing frostbite spells at him. It might mean just blindly stacking regen on your characters. It might mean just blindly scaling your characters, anything that is just preparing for that boss, right? 600 HP is nothing to take lightly. That's a lot of damage you have to get in to beat him. And, 10 to 20 Pyre damage here and there is nothing compared to the amount of damage, like letting him get through on even like 100 health will do, right? Daedalus at 100 health, that's going to be 4 hits or so. 4 times 9, you do the math. That's like 30 something. I'm too brain dead to even know it. I know it's in the 30s. What is that? 30, 36? I don't know. My brain is shot at this point. Don't judge me. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully this guide was useful. The next one that's coming out, I'm just going to go in order here. I'm going to do mid-game next. Look to see that one in the near future. And then I'll do an endgame one. That'll be short and sweet because I don't want to, make it too redundant with the Seraph guide that I already did. And then after that, I'll have another short and sweet one that's going to be a cavern guide. And then after that, I don't really know. I won't really commit to anything after that. But yeah, thanks for watching. Definitely appreciate the feedback I've gotten from the few of you that kind of leave comments here and there. So yeah, peace.